The preeminent challenge facing the U.S. obviously is poor economic growth, not in the cyclical sense, although that's real, but in the long-term structural decline in the pace of economic growth in the United States. Most places, including my old shop, CBO, place the long-term potential for U.S. growth at about 2% per year. To just give you a flavor for what that means, between the end of World War II and 2007, the U.S. economy grew at an average rate of 3.2% per year, which meant that even with population growth, GDP per capita, a crude metric of the standard of living, could double on average every 35 years. And so in my view, that meant that in a single working career, each American had the opportunity to reach their version of the American dream, whatever it might be, send someone to college, get a house the first time, whatever. If you take 2% in projected population growth, the standard of living doubles roughly every 75 years. And so the American dream is disappearing over the horizon, and this I believe to be our number one problem, something that we need to address. A related problem, and one that hits even more quickly than I think people realize, is the federal budget outlook. As a former CBO director, it is my moral obligation to be the voice of doom, so at this point I'm just going to try to make you want to drink, but give me a couple minutes on this topic. If you think, for example, of the situation that will be facing whoever wins the presidential election, they will walk into the Oval Office, and then some nerdy person like me is going to wander over from OMB and say, "Sir, madam, we have a problem. The problem is this. If we leave the federal budget on autopilot for the 8 years of your 2 terms, we'll get to 2024 and have $1 trillion deficit. It'll be roughly 4% of GDP. It will be rising. That deficit will have about 60% of it accounted for by interest on previous borrowing, and interest will now be larger than national security spending as a program of the government. And all of this is going to be unsustainable. That will be your legacy." Obviously, that's an untenable legacy, and I don't believe that any president can let that happen. And so they're going to now start looking into that and realize that the fundamental problem is not that revenues have somehow disappeared from the budget radar screen, or that somehow Congress has gone on an annual spending spree. They can't. There are caps on all those categories. Instead, they're going to find out that the large entitlement spending programs, the Medicares, Medicaids, Affordable Care Acts, Social Securities of the world, are ramping up rapidly. In a world with nominal growth that looks like 4%, you're going to have Social Security growing at over 6, Medicare growing at 5.9, Medicaid growing at 5.2. Whatever the actual numbers are, the basic message is demands for resources are going to outstrip the rate at which resources are growing, and these programs are going to drive red ink in the federal budget. Now, obviously, those 2 problems are interrelated. If we grow more rapidly, just even a 1/10% more rapidly over 10 years, CBO says that fixes the budget by about $300 billion. So if you went back, by a full percentage point somehow, you'd have a $3 trillion swing in the red ink. That would be an enormous success. So better growth would help the budget outlook. It's also true that improving the budget outlook, I believe, will improve the growth prospects in the U.S. If you're an international investor thinking about locating or expanding in the U.S., you're looking at a country that's on an unsustainable trajectory, and you have to start doing some math, which says, okay, what are the possible outcomes here? Well, one is that the U.S. could do nothing. It could stay on autopilot, and that's a predictable calamity of a Greece-Portugal style. The only unknown question is the timing. Financial crises are notorious for being difficult to figure out the timing. They're usually triggered by something unrelated, and that's the scary prospect that it could happen at a moment you just didn't expect. Second possibility is you could try to fix the problem by taxing more heavily. Imagine a $1 trillion tax increase in a 2% economy. You don't have to be a raving supply-sider, which I probably am, to imagine that that's going to have really bad growth consequences for the U.S. Or you could imagine getting the programs under control and getting them to be sustainable over the long term and have the budget not explode. And that would require structural reforms to the entitlement spending programs. That should be the top priority for the next president. And it would have a bunch of salutary effects, the primary one being taking off the table a threatening debt crisis, all good. It's also true that it would allow more room in the budget for the annual discretionary spending programs, the things that are national security, basic research, infrastructure, education, the things that our founders thought were the role of the government. Those are being steadily squeezed out of the operations of the government by these large transfer programs that run on autopilot every year. The other beneficial effect that you'd get out of something like that is you would change the way you think about economic policymaking. In my lifetime, I have seen the economics profession, I have seen the political establishment learn a lesson in the 60s and 70s, which is that you cannot run the US economy from Washington in a command and control fashion with temporary targeted discretionary policies to shave off business cycle peaks and shave off business cycle troughs and somehow target inflation and unemployment to get some beneficial combination of low inflation and a good unemployment rate. We tried all that in the 60s and 70s. It was a miserable failure. Ended up with sustained high unemployment, sustained high inflation. We swore it off, and for a couple of decades stuck to the fact that fiscal policy should be set for long-run growth purposes. And if there was going to be any short-term management of the economy, it was the Federal Reserve's job. We somehow unlearned that lesson. On my watch at the White House in 2001, again in 2002, 2003, 2005, 2007, checks in 2008, and the Recovery Act in 2009, none of which succeeded at all in managing a business cycle. And so I think it's time to relearn the lesson and set these policy instruments for long-term growth so that we can actually get better performance. The last thing we would do, and this is the part that gets overlooked too much when the green eye shades people like me talk about it, is we can actually deliver a social safety net that America would be proud of. Our Social Security program is a disgrace. It is kept solvent on the books because we were promising, honest, really, to cut benefits for people in retirement by 25% across the board in a couple of decades. That's no private sector entity could get away with that. That's terrible. Let's get a program we might want to be proud of. Medicare is the same thing. We spend enormous amounts of money. The gap between payroll taxes and premiums going in, spending going out is $300 billion a year. We're getting 10,000 new beneficiaries every day. It's an enormous financial sinkhole, and we don't get high quality outcomes. And we ought to be able to do better with that kind of money and the kinds of medical technologies in the United States. Medicaid may be the most disgraceful, the largest public health program in the United States, where getting an insurance policy doesn't guarantee you access to providers, means you're probably going to end up in the emergency room for ordinary care at higher rates than the uninsured. And so it should be the goal to do these reforms. They're desirable from a growth perspective, they're necessary from a budgetary perspective, but they ought to be something that we aim for as a country, because these are not programs worthy of the United States. I'll close with the laundry list of the rest of things I'm worried about. Tax reform for sure, and I can come back and give you a sermon on that. I'm a former editor of the National Tax Journal, hot read, definitely want to subscribe. Solves all sleep problems. And then I'd stipulate we should really think hard about regulatory reform. One of the fun things about running a think tank is you get to have an intern program. Interns are great fun. At AAF, we make them read the Federal Register every day, and some die, you get new interns. And we add up the self-reported cost to complying with federal rulemaking. And since the January when Barack Obama took the presidency, this administration has passed a costly rule, finalized a costly rule at a rate of 1.1 per day every day. The cumulative self-reported, this is what the administration thinks, self-reported burden of those regulations on the private sector is $800 billion. So that's about a $100 billion tax increase through the regulatory state every year. And I would just stipulate that if everyone knew that there was a $100 billion tax increase every year, I think a lot of people would be saying, geez, is that really a good idea? We're just not doing that well. And so I think getting that under control is a preeminent challenge for the next president. The last in my laundry list is to get serious about immigration reform in the United States and finally try to get a K-12 education system that we can be proud of. If we were to do that, if we were to do entitlement reform, tax reform, regulatory reform, immigration, and education reform, I could retire happy, and the United States would have no problems in the 21st century. All of our difficulties are self-inflicted wounds that can be fixed.